Because the more grounded you are, then you're able to say, hey, this is what success means to me. And you're able to say it more confidently because you actually think you can make it happen. I think a lot of times we're afraid. I know I definitely had this. You're afraid to say what you want because you actually don't think you can make it happen. And so you hold back. And as you get grounded in your core values and what I call your core process or how you operate, just your confidence in yourself goes up, and then you're able to say, you know what, I want this, I want this, I don't want that. And you start to get more and more clarity around what success means. You start to take more action towards it, and it just becomes a more like alive for you in your life.
Welcome to Wendy Goes Deep. I am Wendy, and today I have Joey Chandler on with me. If you don't know Joey, he went from burnout to true success by seeing there is a difference between who we are and how we operate. Now he helps people ask the question, what does true success mean to me, and how can I make that happen?
Welcome.
Welcome,
Thank you so
Joey.
much for having me.
I don't know if you know this about me or even the people listening, because people know me from different places. And a lot of times they hear me talking about like orgasm and pleasure or psychedelics, but they do not necessarily know that I'm also a business coach. And actually my, tagline or brand name is called the Success Doula. So when you showed interest in coming on my podcast, I knew I had to talk with you because that even that question that you start out with, I know to be essential. But I would love to hear about why you think this is such an important
Yeah,
question.
thanks so much. I just I have to say is that when my son was born, we had a doula, and I went from like being very very skeptical of doulas to literally, if she had said I need to double my fee, when I would have wrote the check, because doulas are amazing, and I didn't realize. And so that helping people go on their journey through all the ups and downs is, I just want to applaud you for. I know it's not doula, that type of doula, but it's the same sort of thing, and I just want to applaud you for that. Um, yeah,
Oh,
I think so. I think asking what does success has, one, it's what I like to talk about. This was actually a big thing for me. I've always been someone who talked about core values and purpose and why and all these kind of things that are kind of fundamental. And it's been in the last year where I've been really like, you know what? I actually really like success. I like to win. I like to achieve goals. I like that. And it's taken a while for me to admit that, because I thought, I didn't want to be selfish or not. I grew up in a family of far left politics and all this stuff that it was getting in the way of me really being able to say, wait a minute, I love to succeed. I love to win. I love when I do well. And and so I've been starting to ask people just like, what does success mean to you? And it just brings up so many different things. People talk about, maybe it might be success with family or success in business, success in sex, success in wherever it is. And I just think it's a very interesting conversation to have, in large part because so many times we're kind of dealing with the day to day of life. And it's like, oftentimes I'd be talking about, well, what's your biggest problem, or how can we find a solution? And it's just trying to get by that stuff. But when you give those people the space to say, what does success really mean to them? It just starts a conversation and allows kind of a bigger picture of what they really want. And then it creates the space for us to say, okay, what do we have to do here? What can we do to help you move forward, and that sort of thing.
as I said, right aligned with where I come from too and what I learned. I also learned the same thing too, because I know I had this elusive idea of what success meant. And especially with, I have ADHD, and a lot of the people I work with have ADHD. We have a tendency to really do the activities that boost the dopamine, which means something that's like new and novel. And it's really easy to say, oh, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to do that thing, I'm going to do that thing, when you're lacking the neurochemistry to like stay put. Right. um and it was in the process, I discovered for myself, I was lucky to, find someone to work with. Would have been a lot quicker if I had found you at the beginning. um, to help me define success, because then I started realizing these different things that I was going towards weren't even really part of my definition of success. And also, I know that success changes over time, at least, you know, for me and my clients. Is that the same for you?
Absolutely. I find that the more grounded you are in who you are, and this is where I work with core values and really understanding who the person is, because the more grounded you are, then you're able to say, hey, this is what success means to me. And you're able to say it more confidently because you actually think you can make it happen. I think a lot of times we're afraid. I know I definitely had this. You're afraid to say what you want because you actually don't think you can make it happen, and so you hold back. And as you get grounded in your core values and what I call your core process or how you operate, just your confidence in yourself goes up, and then you're able to say, you know what, I want this, I want this, I don't want that. And you start to get more and more clarity around what success means. You start to take more action towards it, and it just becomes a more like alive for you in your life.
Yeah. Um, I know you said core values. I have something that I use in my business. I call them keystones. It's basically the same thing. For those who do not know what a keystone is, on those arches, it's that one piece of the stone that actually helps keep the stone arch kind of up and not falling down. And I'm curious to see how you define core values as compared to my keystones, just as a another from one professional to
Yeah.
another.
So my approach to core values started about 10 years ago. I was doing tribute videos for people. And these are videos like if you want to do a video for your mom or your dad, you get 30 or 40 people together and all saying what they love and appreciate about the person. And then you show it, you put it all together and you show it at a birthday party. And I did several hundred of those as a business in the 20 teens. And in that process, I started to see that it wasn't immediate, but I started to see that everyone had a theme. There was a theme in the video that they were about love or joy or happiness. It was something like that. It wasn't loud. It wasn't overt. It wasn't like everybody said the same thing. But once I could see it, I saw it everywhere. And I did videos for people from 7 to 90 all over the world. And and I was like, wow, we have this, clearly we have this thing. And the way I see it is that as we live our life, or as like the people about the videos were living their life, they would act and interact with clients, or not clients, with their friends and their family. And then their friends and family would reflect that back to them. And what was happening is that because I spent so much time watching these videos, I could start to pick up on it. And I had a history of coaching and transformation and kind of awareness stuff, but I mean, it was literally like years of my life watching people say something nice about someone they love, and it influenced me. So I had the sense that we all had this thing at our core. And then I went to work. I'm like, how can I bring this core thing, from the background of our life to the foreground? And I worked out a process to do that. And I found that people are generally about love, joy, happiness, excitement, or freedom. Those are like the top five. And but those are big, broad words, right? And they're going to mean different things to different people. So I went and I did this process, and we would come up with five. I called them pillars at the time, but they're core values, keystone. And we came up with five. And but then in 2022, and this is the part of my intro where I burnt out. I hit a wall. I was going through divorce. I was living alone. It was post COVID. Just a bunch of, my business was struggling. Just a bunch of stuff. And I woke up one day and I said, I'm done. I can't be anything but me. I just don't have the energy. And a couple of days after that, I said, well, okay, if I can only be me, then who am I and how can I be more of that? And in a few days after that, I heard the story about the Navy SEALs, and they put everything in sets of three. Because apparently, when you're getting shot at in a war zone, you can remember three things versus anything more. And at the time, I was like, well, it wasn't a polite language, but I was like, screw it. Like, I'm too tired. I'm just going to reduce everything down to three core values. And I did. It wasn't like this really profound intellectual awareness sort of thing. It was simply because I was just too tired. I didn't have the energy. So I got my core values down to courage, connection, and curiosity. And from that day, I could wake up each day and say, how can I bring courage, connection, or curiosity to my day? At the beginning of the day, or the beginning of that time, it was like, I'm going to wake up, get a drink of water, walk around my room, get back into bed, because that's the only energy I had. But through that, I took lots of baby steps. My sense of courage, connection, and curiosity grew. And those baby steps eventually became bigger steps. And within a few months, I had recovered from burnout without doing any extra focus on meditation or journaling or any of the kind of the standard anti-burnout stuff. And I was like, whoa. And what that just taught me is that we put so much energy into pretending who we think we should be or who we ought to be or who we need to be, that one, if we can actually be ourselves, that's really helpful. But then you got to practice. You got to build up the muscles like that. All those questions I was asking every day, how can I bring courage, connection, and curiosity? That was essentially me building up my muscles to be myself in more places. So then a few months later, after that, I was just like, wow. And so now I help people identify three core values, and I have a process for that. But it's all the ideas based on we identify who they are at their core, that love or joy or happiness, and then what are three values that help them experience that and share that with other people. So that's my approach to core values.
I love it. There's a couple things about what you just said. First, the fact that you had courage, connection, and curiosity. I don't remember if it was. I feel like it might have been my 2022 Keystones. Those were my three. I know curiosity was stayed on there for a long time. I do shift them as I grow and I change, and as I kind of embody the keystone, and I don't need to focus on it as much because it's actually now just a way of being. But it's just really funny that I was like, you picked like the three that I had for a really long time. Okay, we're at
Yep,
the
yep.
right place, having
That's
the
why
right
we're talking.
conversation.
Yep.
um, and then I like that you have, a process too. And there's something with everything. There's always like more than one way. There's always more than one way to skin a cat, right? Where you can get to the kind of the same outcome, but at the end of the day, you're still skinning cat, right? And so maybe there's different ways to go about this, but one of the things, the theme that I see, it is about really uh, embracing what I call unapologetic authenticity, where you really just show up as you are, who you are, and go with that. And I love that you also have a process to develop this. How have you seen, not just in business, but how have you seen, like, do you have any examples of how when you started focusing on connection, how it showed up, or curiosity,
Uh,
or courage,
yeah,
whichever one?
I can't remember like exactly like when it was like. I always go because they've lived very real for me right now. That's the and by making them three and simplify them, they become part of like my everyday. Just the thing that just popped in my head when you said that is I had to let go. I was in the early stages of working with a client, and I realized that we were just kind of seeing the world in a different way. And this would have been a client that would have been a great client for me, a good, it was the ideal client. We were getting along in all sorts of ways, but I just started to feel like we weren't connected. Like there was just something that was off. And so then I'm like, okay, let me, I know the feeling now when I'm really connected with somebody and when I'm not. And I'm like, what's going on here? And what I started to see is that the way I look at the world is kind of a cycle or free wheel or a flywheel. What I call, I say we go. It's basically like
Mhm.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're constantly growing and moving moving forward because that's been my experience. Like I didn't go 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm out of burnout. It was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Success, failure. It was lots of that, and the way he saw the world was much more we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's the end result, which a lot of people it's like I'm like that's awesome, you should do that, you should find somebody that really aligns with that. That's not the way that I aligned with, and it was like and it took me a little while to have the courage to say hey thanks but no thanks because I could really have used that client. uh, and so that
Mhm.
like that is just to me just a good example, and it just happened this past week of one understanding what for me what connection meant and what it feels like, having the curiosity to be like hey what's going on here, and then having the courage to say what you want to say, even to say what needs to be said even if you don't want to say it and it feels awkward.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great example of how it it seems silly sometimes. I think when I start working with people, the uh, what's the what's the thing I'm trying to say right now? The the way they're presenting themselves is that they feel silly kind of doing these activities and like, why aren't we getting into business right now? And they do it almost like just to appease me, not necessarily that they're tied to, the process. And then as I keep bringing them back to their keystones or their values, as we work together, they start going, oh, oh,
Yep.
oh. And now my long term clients, they're like, I did my keystones. Right. And then they know how it works and how you really can, transform your business, your life by honoring who you are and honoring what you're trying to create, because I think that's part of the success part is you're not really honoring what you're trying to create, because success does look so different for every
Yeah, I was gonna
individual.
say one of the things that went through my head is I realized one of the ways I define success is making a difference for myself and for others in a way that aligns with who I am. And I have said that, in the past, but this past week with that client, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to be able to be who I am if I'm constantly worried about kind of that circle versus linear approach, trying to be, trying to say it in a way that will fit with him. If I have to keep doing that, that's not me honoring who I am. So I'm like, okay, I got to speak up about this.
Congrats on living and breathing and being, who you are, because it seems like it should be simple, but it's not so easy to do. Um, One of the other things that you talked about, so we talked about the keystones, you also talked about process. So I'm super curious because I have this like method that I teach, people for figuring stuff out called the unicorn method. And the first part is the unapologetic authenticity. But I'm curious, what's your core process? Because I see the keystones as a component of the unapologetic authenticity, but it's not the whole entire process.
Yeah.
What's yours? What's
Yeah.
yours? What's your
So
process?
I call my that's the truly successful system. And the idea being that you can create the life that you want that's aligned with who you are. And where this came from is after I burnt out and then after I recovered, I was like all in on core values. I'm like, core values, this like I got a little a much, a little much on that. But after if it was somewhere I don't know exactly when it was. Like if I recovered by like June, somewhere in the next 6 or 8 months, I started to recognize that there's a difference between who we are and how we operate. And while core values are really, really helpful and really powerful in all sorts of different ways, they're they're not as effective, or at least people don't see them as an effective tool for like day-to-day activities and for moving things forward. And even though I love talking about core values, like it just there was something off. And so I played with a bunch of different things, and I basically settled on this idea of what I call a core value or core process, and it's 5 steps. And what I found is that pretty much anybody I can talk to, we can go through. And I simply ask, like, when you first work with someone or first take on a project, what's the first thing you do? And they'll say, usually it's develop some sort of understanding of the person, connect with them in some way. Then we say, okay, what do you do after that? And then they'll have a step. And what do you do after that? And what do you do after that? And we'll end up with 5 steps. And the fourth step leads back into the first one. In the idea that as you take action, you generally learn from it. And then that teaches you more about whatever you knew you were doing. And so my process is that I ask people what success means to them. I have that conversation. We talk about their core values. We identify their core values. We develop their core process. And then the last part is we start to look at what I call your core systems. What are the systems you need in place to support yourself so that you can do the things that you want to do? And then lastly, how do you grow? Like what can you evaluate? What can you celebrate? What can you learn from doing this thing that will teach you more about success? Because then you learn more about success, and the whole thing kind of starts over and over again. And that has it's really interesting because I've been basically going through the process as I've been creating the process. Like I had all the pieces from the very beginning, like from the day I burnt out, I was doing this exact same thing. And I just didn't have the awareness of it until this past year. And I think this is a big component of it is that once we identify someone's process, they just go around and around and around and they start to develop their muscles to use it. And when I know it's working, when someone will come to me and they'll say, I use my process over here and this thing that we hadn't talked about at all, but they're like, I used it and it worked. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And that's kind of that's when I know that it's working. When people aren't doing that, I know that there's some work to do with them to get them to really own how they operate.
Oh, that's so awesome. You know, there was something when you were talking that came to mind because you mentioned something else earlier too about how, to get out of the burnout, the typical things, the journaling, all the different practices. I'm a huge proponent of them. Actually, I will uh, I will say this many times and will continue to say it. I made a commitment to journal every day for a year many years ago, and it completely changed my life. So I'm not saying anything against journaling or any of the other tools out there, but there is something super powerful about speaking with and to other individuals about what you're trying to do and create. And it doesn't matter how much you put things down on paper. It that like that whatever helps bring it into the world happens through the conversations. And I feel really honored as a coach, and I'm sure you do too, like watching how people take these ideas from their head and then be able to voice them and guide them so they can
Yeah.
create,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. Do
right?
you have your people talk to other people about their keystones?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I do group coaching, so we share the keystones within the
Because
group
it's a real
versus
like
one
I
on
it's one of my exercises. Like, you go out and just talk to people about your core values. Like, go, like, for me, I would go and say, hey, what does courage mean to you? And just have a conversation about it, because all of these words, courage, connection, curiosity, whatever keystone someone might have, they mean different things to different people. We think that what we
one.
mean, it means to us, is what it means to others. And so we don't recognize that our perspective on that particular thing, or our perspective on the world, is unique and valuable and different than other people. And I find, and this is one reason why I'm a big proponent of getting core values down to something very, very simple that you can use and share, because then they're easy to bring up in conversation. I can talk about courage, I can talk about connection or curiosity, because it's everyday language. And so all of the core values, we get it really simple, but
Mhm.
you're 100% right. There are things that you will learn about yourself and what you're up to and your core values only by talking to other people. And there'll be things you learn about other people only by looking at yourself. There's that back and forth.
Yep. Um, when you Another point that you brought up right now, that whether or not you meant to, I'm huge on definitions, especially as I talk when I'm talking like neuroscience stuff, because sometimes you have to use common language to explain really complicated things. So I get really clear on definitions, and that's part of the keystone activity that I or the values, right? Like
Yep.
there's all these different ways to do it. It's really about getting clear, like what does this word actually mean to you? And I love that you have this along with success, because they're two separate things, right? Success is talking about outcome and it needs to be defined, but even understanding these values, that like who you are in it, in essence, you're just talking about who you are, right? And how you want to be in the world, and where more often than not maybe you are
Yeah.
hiding, right? Or not allowing yourself to
Yeah.
be,
Yeah. What
and those
Yeah,
definitions are
I absolutely
important.
think they are. And I think the more you talk about them, you get more clear on what it means to you. And in one of the things that, like, you were just there, I started thinking about, like, talking about success for me takes a ton of courage, because I've had, I got divorced, I got this, I got all these things that you would not put under the success category. And it's taken me a while to be like, how can I actually talk about success when I haven't been? And what I realize is that it's not about that. As I have this system that helps people move forward, so I can talk about that all day long, regardless of how good or bad I feel. And I think this is an important part of
Mhm.
understanding our core values, is that there are places in our lives where we can be 100% ourselves without hesitation, without any problems, where we can be that. And there's places where we struggle. And it doesn't matter how much you know about your core values. It doesn't matter how grounded you are. It doesn't matter anything. There's places where you're doing awesome, and there's places where you kind of suck. And by when I got that moment, when I realized like it doesn't matter how aware, how whatever, how successful I am, there's places going to be where I feel like I'm doing really well, and there's places where I'm not. And that it freed me up because I'm like, oh, I don't have to be perfect. But it also was like, oh, I'm never going to be perfect. Like I'm never going to be able to. There's all like I'm never going to get to that end place, and that's really what drove that circle thing. Because once I started to accept that you're always going to, there's always going to be some place that you're bumping up, and you're always going to be growing, you're always going to be learning, then you're never reaching that spot. And it was both really freeing and really confronting when I got it. I was like, I still remember that moment of like, oh, I'm never going to be perfect. Like, oh, I want to be perfect. And so that's just part of accepting to me that cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting on, here I'm going to throw in a little neurobiology, right? The neurochemical basis of satisfaction. So when it's, you know, taken into consideration across multiple people, different places where they live, and looking at the neurochemistry, satisfaction occurs when in pursuit of a
Mm-hmm.
goal. And unfortunately, so much of our society has kind of shifted it to reaching the goal, like to getting the goal, instead of understanding that a satisfactory life, like actually being happy in your life, actually enjoying your life, is in
Hmm.
pursuit of a goal. And it's such a different shift in concept, but you basically said it how you got to experience it. Once you realize it's not the pursuit, it's not that actually
Yep.
being perfect that's going to make you happy, but once you realized it was actually in the pursuit of improvement, that it
Oh,
actually, that's where the
oh, I
happiness
love that.
goes.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, because yeah, because when I talk to people, it's never about like I did this. It's like this sense of this experience that they brought some aspect of who they are to a situation in a new way, and it opened up something. I, I was thinking of this guy, one client who he was going through his process. He's one of the guys that came back to me like I used it, and he was talking to a girlfriend about her relationship with her 14-year-old daughter, and from a guy's perspective, talking to a mom about her relationship with a daughter uh, is fraught for danger, right? Like, there's ways to mess up in so many different ways. But he's like, we were talking, and then I just said, hey, I have this process that I've been working on. Can we just walk through it? And he just walked through his steps of his process. And he's like, I wasn't really coaching her. I just was like, here's the next question, which was, his process. And he was so happy because I don't even know what she said, but he's like, we had such this great conversation. And I felt like like, for a guy to be able to help a mom with her relationship with her daughter is like huge by any way. And he's not like a trained therapist or anything. He just has this process that he used. But what you said is the fact that he used it in that he tried to use it. It wasn't even so much the end result, but he used it, and the experience that he had with her was so, he just felt great. He was so excited about it. And so I think that fits really well to what you're saying.
I love that because it's it's so easy to hear different concepts, hear catchphrases, hear, like, oh, that's a great Instagram post and a quote, and oh, I'm going to remember that one. Or that's an affirmation, which they all have their time. All these tools have a time and a place, right? But it's about learning how to kind of work with them. And it is in that process of create, because whenever we're in creation, right? Like in a state of creating, it's, you're not stressed,
Mm.
you're right, like, because if your mind is in that curiosity, that's one of the reasons I love curiosity. If anyone ever gets stuck for a value to pick, focus on curiosity from a neuroscience perspective. You can't be stressed when you're
Oh,
curious.
can I ask you a couple questions about because I've had this thought in my head, and I haven't had an opportunity to really talk to anybody about it, and haven't done the research. So my experience of asking how can I bring courage, curiosity, and connection to my day, it feels like my brain has been rewired. Like it's now I'm just I still have days where I wake up and, everything sucks and it's all bad. But oftentimes I'm now like, okay, how can I bring some courage connection? It's just like this process that I go to, and it feels like my brain has been a bit rewired, and it feels like, because I have practiced using those words over and over again, it has kind of taken up the space more than all the I sucks and I'm not good enough and the world is horrible. Those sorts of words, they still show up, but I'm just so much, my muscles to get back to that place of exploring how can I bring more of my core values to the situation is um it's just, I just feel stronger at it, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if that does that align
Yep.
with what you understand about
Yep.
all the workings of the brain.
Yep. So when we're in that place of I suck, the negative self talk that everyone experiences, right? When this is using a part, I'll talk about networks in the brain because the different parts don't just do one thing, they work together. Kind of think of the different brain parts as like letters in the alphabet, and together they make words, and together the words make sentences and different outcomes. So networks, you kind of think of them as like sentences or paragraphs,
Yep.
right? So there's a brain network called the default mode network, and this is where we were able to, like, you just now were able to pick up a glass and take a drink and still listen to me, right? And you're still sitting in your chair and you're not
Right,
falling
right, right.
over. Like, you're not having to think about all the things that you're actually having to do in every moment. That's our default mode network. And one of the parts of the default mode network is it helps keep us completely aware of everything that's happening kind of within ourselves. It's called self-referential. So the way we're looking at things is coming from this place of self. When and it can be a very stressful place, also not, but like when you're stressed, you immediately go into that. So if you are stressed, you will be in that more self-referential place because it uses the least amount of energy. So if you're stressed in life, that means your body's going to try to conserve energy, so you'll stay in that default mode network. Now let's say you're safe, you're sitting at your computer, you're not getting attacked by a lion, like your body is physically, like, you're not in danger. Like, I know right now in this moment, I'm not in danger. However, my mind could think I am, right? It could think that the sky is going to fall, I'm not going to be able to pay my bills, all of the things. That keeps you in that self-referential place. However, if you're able to stop and move into curiosity. How can I bring connection into my life? How can I bring courage into my life? How can I bring more curiosity into my life? You shift your brain from that self referential place to the outward perspective of seeing what's actually around and how you actually show
Hmm.
up in the world, for lack of a better way of explaining it. It uses not cognitive, more cognitive functioning, right? That logical, uh, that executive, higher functioning thinking, the what we're always told to do, like think your way out of stuff. But that curiosity part, when you shift to curiosity, you send a signal that you're not
Hmm.
stressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
Does
yeah,
that
yeah.
make sense? Right. Um, and so because you're now not making cortisol, you actually have more energy to stay over in that more logical thinking. If you are thinking stressfully, right? Like, how am I
Right.
going to pay my bills? That's a stressful thought. That's not curiosity, right? That is there's no curiosity in that. It's a grounded like curiosity truly is like a grounded um awareness of something outside of
That's
yourself.
interesting. You could, I'm wondering, like, you could shift to be like, how could I pay my bills? Like, what are some different ways that I could? There's a way of asking, how can I pay my bills? That's curious, and
Yeah.
there's a way that's, I guess it sounds like more of that default, like, oh, oh crap, sort of mode, and it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And if I'm bringing this idea of like, how can I bring courage, connection, curiosity more and more often? Would I be more? Does it make sense that I feel like I'm more able to ask those? Like, the more I ask the questions, the more I can ask the questions.
Yes. So as you get in that practice of being curiosity in that more, and I say grounded because just like what you kind of alluded to that as well, where you could ask the questions in that kind of frenzy state versus a open, right? We know that feeling. We know when we're pushing, trying to like grasp
Yep.
for the answers versus, what are the answers? Right. And when you're in that more receptive, what are the answers? Just even thinking about the body, right? Like when you're like trying to find it, you're leaning forward, you're moving forward. This is actually a sympathetic action. So thinking about the nervous system, it's a sympathetic direction of energy. When you stop and take a moment, you actually are going into a parasympathetic, which is a receiving. When you spend more time in a balanced between sympathetic and parasympathetic, then your nervous system is relaxed, you produce less cortisol, and you can stay more in um, that that less self-referential and more into that flow state. So it's actually, this is how you get into flow state is, I think people know they want to be in that state. It feels
Right.
better, right? When you're not stressed. Um, it is about turning down and getting into that more receptive, grounded
Right.
state of
It's
being.
interesting. I've been playing the idea of in sales conversations, having conversations with clients and walking them through a sales process. And what I find is by asking questions about like, what does success mean to you and how can we help you understand, by being much more aligned with them and supportive of them to ask these questions, I'm finding they're more and more they're relaxing and they're going deeper and they're having these, and we're just having these really great quote sales conversations. And I'm wondering if part of that is that I'm helping them get curious about these different questions, what it means to them, how can they apply it to life, and that's helping them get out of that stress mode and more into that openness side.
Yes. So there's two parts about what you're doing. I love that. When you say you stop and get into a more supportive state, what you're doing on the one side, like the energetic side, you're you're shifting from that, how do I get the
Right.
answers from them, to that more receptive state. When you do that, you're regulating your nervous system, and humans are designed to regulate their nervous system with the people they're talking with. And so the more you as a coach, as a someone that's a professional that's helping someone else, the more you stay regulated, the more you help the other person, even if you
Yep.
do nothing else. If all you do is stay in that grounded state of receptivity, you help them shift from being
Oh,
stressed. And when doing so, they can have more, awareness and eye-opening experiences and make the changes that they want to make. It's it's a relatively simple thing,
yeah.
relatively simple thing, but extremely powerful, and is at the core of why even therapy is effective, or coaching is a therapy, or coaching is effective. Like these different modalities of talking, it's actually at the core of why they're effective. It has to do with the person that you're working with. If they stay grounded, it will help you make changes and shifts
Right. And
astronomically.
it's so interesting because one of the things that over this past years I've been doing this is that people develop their core process, their 5 steps, and it essentially becomes their coaching model. This is how I help people produce results. And I had one client who had this tendency of getting overwhelmed. She would help people do incredible work, and then they would get to a spot of like, and I want to do this and this and this, and she would start to get a sense of like, I don't know if I can help you. Like it was like she started to get overwhelmed, and then the way she described it, it was like she had one conversation. She's like, he said all this amazing stuff, and I realized I wanted to go help my kids. Like she was like, I'm out of here because she got really overwhelmed, and we talked about it. And what we realized is that she wasn't relying on her process. When she got overwhelmed, she went to some other place instead of saying, okay, I think her first one is like acknowledgement. Like I want to acknowledge you was her first step. And and what that taught me was is that when we have a system that we can rely on, that we know works, that we've practiced, that we know that helps us and that we can walk people through, it takes the stress out of like coaching and trying to support people. Because now, like for me, if I talk to someone and they're like, they got whatever, some big thing that they're working on, I take a breath and I say, okay, hey, what does success mean to you? And then we just go right there. And that helps me stay grounded, me be at my best. So then I have the greater ability to be with them. And now I'm thinking about it. When I forget to do some of those steps, the conversations just aren't as good. I end up having to try to force it or this or get them to all that kind of stuff. And so I'm guessing what I've been doing, and I thank you for this. This is I don't know if this was the intention of the call, but what I've been helping people do is stay grounded in who they are, so they can stay more grounded, and that creates the space of helping their clients more effectively.
Yep. So another point on the neurobiology of exactly what you said there. Um, you said it's like I'm practicing, and therefore it gets easier. When you are stressed, when you're really stressed, it is almost impossible to do a new behavior. You may have learned about it, right? You may have like, oh, I'm supposed to do box breathing or, whatever the gazillion different, things people say to do. If you have not practiced it, it will not be accessible to you in the times when you're
Oh,
stressed. So the fact that you're running through this process over and over again with your clients, that's what allows them to do it when they're stressed. It's not just doing it once. It's not like signing up, getting the freebie online, filling out the form, filling out the cool workbook, and then leaving it and expect that you've now, like, through osmosis, figured out exactly how to show up with this new knowledge. It is the practicing of the new behaviors that allows you to do it
right.
in times of
Oh,
stress.
again, you're just like triggering all my brain. I've been talking to people about corporate core values. And when I first started doing this core
Mhm.
value work, because everybody and their brother is talking about corporate core values, and there was something that was always off. And what I've started to think about is that it doesn't actually matter all that much what the corporate core values are. It's about the personal core values and our ability to use those core values in our work, because we have far more experience with our personal core values than even if it's like the most perfect, beautiful, wonderful corporate core values. In times of stress, we're going to resort back to the way who we are and how we do things. And finally, I have some like science knowledge on that. But yeah, because it when you talk to people in business, they're so stressed they can barely remember their own core values, let alone a corporate core values. And so I'm thinking we should spend much more time in companies asking, hey, what are your, Mr. Engineer or secretary or, salesperson, what are your core values and how can we help you use them in your job rather than trying to tell you our core values?
Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about corporate. So one of my many careers before I knew how to manage ADHD, I jumped around a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot. But it's all led me to here, so I can't complain. And one of the areas that I did learn about is how complex change happens in business, and there is one component of it that is absolutely, well, there's like seven, and my unicorn method is kind of basically based off of this, but just takes it at an individual perspective and geared towards ADHD. But it's actually from this like foundational concept of, if like MBA level understanding complex change, and it's about consensus. And so a lot of times when there's takeovers, they'll hire these companies to come in to be able to help the change happen. And there's all these different things that they put into place that a lot of times people don't understand why. And if that consensus part is not there, the takeover won't happen, or it'll fail, and there'll be all these things that happen. And when you're talking about individuals, that consensus is actually your core values,
Say,
right? You can't have consensus within yourself to keep doing what you're doing if there's something inherently off with what you're trying to do and what your values are. And it's usually because you haven't defined your values, right? And so you're trying to do something that's actually not aligned with who you are.
I love that idea of that you have to understand your own core values, because if you're not there's not alignment with whatever you see out there, then it's not going to work in some way, shape, or form. And I'm working on a book, and one of the things I think for individuals is that when you identify your own core values and how you do things, you can actually look back at your jobs, even the jobs that you thought were awful, and see where your core values did show up. A lot of people say like, "Oh," and when I ask them like, "Hey, how do you align with your current job?" They're like, "I don't. It's horrible. I just took it for the money," or some version of that. And I always point out like, you took that job for some particular reason. If it didn't align with your core values in some way, or even a perceived way, you wouldn't have taken it. Now, you may have been wrong in your perception, or maybe things changed over time for sure. But people can always look back, and I find that when they can find those little stepping stones of where their core values did show up in their job, it gives them the foundation to either make changes in that job or have the courage and the confidence to go find something new. But it's always there in some way. It's that in some small way.
Yeah. When you were saying that, it reminds me of one of the reasons why I love Halloween. So I love seeing what people dress up as at Halloween. Obviously, it's not who they are, but there's some element of what they chose, because otherwise it wouldn't even
Yeah,
occur to you to
yeah,
choose that, right? And I love the idea of kind of going back into my own personal job history that's quite extensive to see what some of my core values do line up with that. I already started to, when you were talking, I could already start to see how some of them really, yeah, they
yeah,
were
yeah.
right,
Like
like
they're like, yeah.
they're aligned.
I took a job as a shoe salesman in 2008, like when the economy and everything kind of went. Um, and it turns out I was really good at selling shoes. And the very first question I would ask people is, "What are you training for?" This was in San Francisco at that point. Everybody was training for some sort of race, and in retrospect, I was asking him essentially, what is success for you? Like, what are you training for? Right. I was asking a version of that. Then we would talk about, it's funny. Then we would analyze their gait, which is essentially their foundation, their core values. And then what do you need in place? And I was really good at selling like socks and footbeds and heart rate monitors and all those extra things that would help them. And had no idea then, but I was essentially walking through my system. And then I got promoted to management, and I was less good at that, and I actually got fired from that job. I was very best at selling shoes because I could use my system really, really well, even if I didn't know it then.
That's so funny. I'm thinking I had a job as a sales manager for a biometric company. I fell into it. It was interesting. I got offered the sales manager and an admin job at the same, because I had been like I had started out as receptionist and then went into inside sales, and it kind of, either one of those jobs were good for me. The admin side of me, that department, they're like, no, you'd be perfect over here, and the sales team was like, no, you'd be good over here, and I went with the sales. And it was because at the end of the day, I really like talking to people. I really like educating people, because this was a biometric company. So much of my work was helping people understand like what the right solution was. I helped design this like online tool that helped you choose like your best security system based on your needs. So it's like kind of like what you're saying. It's a lot of what I do over in my success doula, and then create a plan of action on how to do it, right? And it's just funny because it really is so aligned with actually what I do, even though it's not, quote unquote,
Yeah.
not related,
And
right?
speaking of not related things, could we talk about core values and sex? I mean,
Okay.
like as
Yeah.
I don't know if we have time or
Yeah.
anything,
Yeah.
but it's something that's been percolating in my head. I have a few friends that are. I have one friend who's like, look, the conversation between sex and money are very, very similar. Like, if you want to have a breakthrough in money, talk about sex, and vice versa,
Mhm.
because the energy is the same. She has this whole thing on it, and it's awesome. And so I just and I actually went through a divorce and all these different things. And so I'm wondering, how is a person being grounded in their core values, understanding how they operate, how might that contribute to to having success sexually.
So when you say sexually, do you mean sexually or do you mean relationship? Because they're
Different.
actually kind
I,
of two different things.
a
And
few
so I
different,
know
right,
they
right,
get
right.
conflated together.
You tell me
Yeah.
which I could talk about. I'd be interested in either
Okay.
one because I could use. But anyway,
Yeah.
we can talk about both.
They're both good
Yeah.
conversations. Uh, so one of the biggest like tools over in like the sex education world that is talked about, but it really needs to get like kind of be out there, kind of like core values really needs to be there for business, especially for solo entrepreneurs, like understand your core values is over in the sex education. They have this tool called like wheel of consent. Betty Martin, she did it, but where they're really similar. So it's kind of like two different pieces working together. So the wheel of consent is really about identifying when you are speaking your truth and when you're not speaking your truth. And that's an essential component, right? So part of what you teach, which is great, is about identifying your core values and then you have them practice it. So you do start noticing, am I creating connection? Am I being courageous? Am I being curious? So they can know whether or not you're in consent with your value, right? But you need the value part of it to even know whether or not you're in consent.
Yep.
Does that make
Yep.
sense? So you can have all this practice of like understanding whether or not something feels good in your body, right? Because that's what the consent work really teaches you is like, oh, this is what no, when I really want to say no, this is actually what it feels like in my body. Oh, when I say yes, this is what it feels like. When I'm unsure, this is what it feels like. Oh, am I people pleasing? Am I trying to prove myself? Like there's all these different ways that we show up that are not necessarily being authentic to who we are. They are still a part of us, but it's not necessarily like or that unapologetic
Yeah.
authenticity, right? Part of that is identifying your values, right? Most people don't know what is important to them. They don't even know what's important to them in their relationship. They don't know what's important to them in the bedroom. So if you think about it as your values, bringing your values into the bedroom, if connection is one of your values, but you're trying to go in for a quick release, is that connecting?
Right.
Right? No. So what does connecting mean? And connecting can mean different things. Some people really just like spending quiet time gazing into each other's eyes or
Right. Right.
whatever and not having any words or conversation, right? Other people really thrive off of conversation and going, deeply conversing about something. So there's but identifying what connection actually means to you is how do you know then to bring it into the bedroom if you haven't even identified what's important to
Right.
you?
And this is so great because it also obviously connection. Um, I need to know what connection means to me, but I also need to know what connection means to my partner, and and having that
Yep.
conversation because sometimes I find with people do know. I think people do have a better understanding of what they really want, but they're sometimes afraid to say it. They haven't
Yeah.
practiced saying it, and so you're afraid to ask for what you want or afraid to for whatever reason, right? And so I think sometimes,
I'm
yep,
going to interject. 98% of the time, the reason is fear of abandonment.
fair enough. But there's something that's stopping us from saying what we want. We won't get it, and so that practice part, and then being able to talk to the other person about, hey, what does because if I'm asking like what do you want, I need to be able to say what I want and to be able to really have that conversation. And if you're like me, you grew up in a world where you weren't really trained to say what you want over time, and you get into a relationship, and then you just kind of go into kind of standard patterns. Let's just say you create your own ruts. The idea of
Yeah.
talking to people about what they want, it takes. And I work some with men, and like and there's so the idea of asking for what men want and saying and to do it in a way that actually works on the other side is so interesting. I think it's so needed.
Yeah. There's a part of the values conversation that I want to bring in here that I don't hear talked about as often. So we do talk, people say, oh, I don't know, you need to know what you want. You need to know what you want. And that's a part of it. But where the values work really comes into play there is also it helps you understand a little bit between the difference between what you need and what you want. And so I'm going to define what I mean by that when I say needs and wants, because everyone's going to have a different understanding, right? So wants are usually having someone change their behavior. It's outside of yourself, it's something you want, and it's nothing you have control over. Versus need is something you actually have control over. And this is where the authentic kind of part comes into play and understanding that. So, even talking about in the bedroom, say you want to talk about your fantasies, right? Maybe that's your actual want. Your want is to talk about fantasies. But really, if the other person is uncomfortable, you're not comfortable, you don't know how to go about it. So, what is it you need? Your need is to feel safe, that you feel safe enough to speak your voice. Do you see how like it actually is irrelevant what the other person is doing? They're going to be involved when you're talking about a relationship, but at the end of the day, it's about okay, what do I need? I need to feel comfortable to speak my mind. And so sometimes it's personal work that we got to do to get through, right? To get through our own fears, our fears of rejection. It's almost always just anyone who's watching, it's almost always ties to some fear of abandonment. I'm going to say this, they're going to think that. It's all a bunch of presumption, fear that is not necessarily based in reality. Right? And but when you get clear on what it is that you need and you're like, this is actually what I need. Once those become so clear, the wants kind of take care of themselves because then you realize that, okay, this is what I need. I don't want anything less now. Like you don't need anyone else to do anything necessarily. You're just going to keep creating the environment to get your needs met because now you're really clear on it.
So so how and so the thought that's in my head is like, how does someone? Because what I hear is a lot of practice, right? To be able to say this is what I need versus what I want, like that. That takes a level of skill, and that only comes from practice, right? Like, and this is what I've seen with core values. The more
Yep.
you talk about your core values, the more you explore them. I have people go talk to what I call their safe people. Like instead of like, you don't want to be talking to your boss or a potential date or an investor about core values the first time because that will get weird and that will not go well. You want to talk to your friends and whoever is safe with you, have that conversation, build up those muscles. Then when you go in that job interview and they say, tell me about yourself, you can say, oh, I do this, this, and this, but these are my core values, and you're able to say it naturally. So in
Exactly.
terms of like sex, if we're talking sex conversations and saying what you want and versus what you need, how does somebody practice that? To make the build up that
So
muscle.
this is where journaling, yeah, journaling will,
Mm,
come into play here, but also sometimes people don't feel comfortable journaling, but being a part of coaching programs where you can talk in a safe environment, whether it's like one-on-one in a group coaching thing, even finding online forums where you can start practicing, speaking up. There's, following the right people on social media and being able to, get into conversations. I love Clubhouse. Clubhouse is, you can often find conversations over there with people with, and there can be relative and
that word, yeah, yeah.
anonymity. What's the word? I mean, it depends on, everyone has their
Right,
different
right,
comfortableness, right? But it is about, you have to do this. Like no
right,
one's
right,
going to
right.
do this work for you. Like they're not, like, if I, even as someone who's practiced doing a lot of this stuff, I still have a lot to do for myself. I can't take on the job of doing it for myself and doing the job for a partner.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? I also have kids. So I also have to keep myself more regulated because it's not their job. It's not the kids' job to regulate me. It's my job to help them learn how to regulate. So I need, personally, I need a partner that does this work on their own. And so then we can show up, together. Right. And then communicate together and talk together. Now, ideally, I think most people would like to have a partner that they can do this work together. And I think that's where in my experience, the couples that do figure out ways to start having these uncomfortable conversations and start getting familiar with being uncomfortable, that's where the growth
Yeah.
happens. And then you discover together.
I think I'm just looking back at my relationship, and I had a, my ex and I were still good friends. We co-parent really well together, um, but there were just a lot of things in that realm that I could see that I wanted to ask for, and I just didn't. Like I was afraid to say, I was embarrassed, I was all sorts of things, and I'm just like, man, I like I got to practice that. I want to be like I want to build up those muscles so I know. And it's one thing to do it intellectually. Oh my gosh. Okay, this is going to be really, really embarrassing, but is that okay? Or I,
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
I haven't done a bunch of dating, but I saw this one particular woman and we connected really well. I just, unfortunately, we didn't have a attraction, but we connected really well. And we were talking on the phone one time and she said, we were talking and it got kind of a little bit heated. And she said, "What do you want?" And total freedom to say whatever I wanted. And I don't want that much, but I had, and I locked up. I could not say a word. Like I was so embarrassed. Then it got embarrassed because I was embarrassed. Like it was so interesting how much I struggled with that. Now, eventually I was able to say some things but it was so interesting. But since that day, I've had so much more freedom because I was able to do something untriggered. But it was really interesting when she was like, "What do you want? Say what you want. You can have anything you want." I like shut down completely.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. So, two things. That was my marriage with my ex. We co-parent. We're great friends. We co-parent. We
Oh, wow.
cohabitate together because it's easier for the kids. But we're not together. Anyways, our marriage was not an openly wonderful communication of needs and wants and desires. This is all since the separation. So it's been, about a little over 7 years. So I've learned a few things since then. And, no one's, unless you grow up, I don't know anyone who grew up in a family where they're like, "Hey kids, let me show you how you're supposed to communicate with your spouse about
Right.
sexual desires." Like no one's learning this stuff, right? Um, at least no one I know is learning this stuff that way. And so it is in kind of growing up and being an adult and finding the places and the people to speak about stuff. And I love that we took this conversation there because it is all intertwined. This is actually one of the things that I saw when I for a while was just focusing on the orgasm. I was just doing orgasm coaching, not even I hadn't quite discovered the neuro pleasure coaching aspect side of it. I was really focused on the orgasm side. And I was doing the consent work with people. And they'd be like, "Hey, I was able to ask for a raise and I've never been able to do that before." Right? It shows all this work that you do on yourself, whether you do it because you're working with an awesome business coach or you're doing it because you're working with, a pleasure coach or someone who's really helping you just tap into who you are authentically and practice being who you are without apologizing. It just bleeds out into everywhere in a beautiful, I don't want to say bleeds. That makes it sound like it's a bad thing. It like spreads out into every direction and kind of creates this environment of just of continuous growth and acceptance, and your fear of abandonment
Right.
starts to dampen.
Right. Yeah. I when I look back at it, that when she asked me that and me processing all that was one of the times that really got me thinking about what do I want and that led into what is success. Like that conversation was very much a part of where I'm at now because I could start to ask and I started asking more people, what do you want? What does success mean to you? And just finding how stuck people are and by helping anybody get grounded in themselves and be able to say this is what I want and then take actions, it's so freeing it makes those conversations much more fun than scary, and it's still scary.
Yes, exactly. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for coming on. If people want to find you, where do they go about
Yeah, I'm
finding
at
you?
joeychandler.net and at joeychandler70 across all social media.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for going deep into the conversation. I really appreciate your vulnerability and showing up authentically
Thank
as
you.
yourself. Thank you for joining for today's episode. I hope you found the conversation interesting, maybe even a little inspiring. And if you're curious about how to work with our guest today, check out the show notes because I'll have all the links and resources there. And if you're curious about how to work with me or what I offer, you can check out my website, wendygoesdeep.com, to learn more about what it is that I do. And I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you for a little favor. Growing this community is only possible with support from people like you. If you could take a moment to like, subscribe, or maybe even share it with a friend, it helps more than you know. And until we can go deep again, stay curious and keep exploring.